The bones of Waterloo's dead fed Europe's next harvest. The Battle of Waterloo ended on the evening of June 18, 1815. By morning, approximately 50,000 men were dead or wounded on a field roughly 3 miles across. The living moved on. The armies dispersed. The politicians convened in Paris to redraw the map of Europe. The dead stayed where they had fallen. For a while. Within years, bone collectors had moved through the Waterloo battlefield and others like it so systematically that contemporary accounts describe the ground as having been almost entirely cleared of human remains. Those remains were loaded onto carts, shipped to ports, transported to England, and delivered to mills in Yorkshire where they were ground into powder and sold to farmers as bone meal fertilizer. The farmers spread it on their fields. The fields produced grain. The grain became bread. This is the story of the bone trade, the openly advertised, commercially structured, scientifically endorsed supply chain that ran directly from the bodies of Europe's war dead to its food supply. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the men who organized this trade were not considered grave robbers. They were considered agricultural entrepreneurs. To understand why this trade existed and why it was considered entirely legitimate, you have to understand the agricultural crisis that was driving demand for fertilizer across early 19th century Europe. The Napoleonic Wars had disrupted agricultural production across the continent for over 2 decades. Fields had been fought over, occupied, stripped of livestock, and left fallow during the years of constant military campaigning. When peace came in 1815, the immediate challenge was feeding a continent whose agricultural infrastructure had been damaged by the same wars that had produced the bones now lying on its battlefields. Soil that had been overfarmed, stripped, or neglected needed restoration. Fertilizer was the answer, and the most effective natural fertilizer available to early 19th century agriculture, more effective than manure, more effective than the composting methods of the era, was ground bone. The chemistry was not fully understood at the time, but practical observation had established clearly that fields treated with bone meal produced significantly better yields than untreated fields. What was not fully appreciated until Justus von Liebig's work in the 1840s was why this worked. Bone is approximately 60% calcium phosphate. When ground into fine powder and applied to soil, it releases phosphorus, an essential plant nutrient that is frequently the limiting factor in agricultural productivity. Without phosphorus, plants cannot develop roots, cannot flower, and cannot produce grain. Bone meal was, in effect, a slow-release phosphorus supplement for depleted soil, and Europe in 1815 had an enormous quantity of bones available. The bone trade that developed was not an informal operation conducted in secret. It was commercially organized from the beginning. Bone merchants established buying networks across multiple countries, employing collectors to work specific territories, battlefield sites, pauper graves, and in some cases the bone repositories of medieval churches and charnel houses that had accumulated centuries of remains. They negotiated prices per ton, arranged transportation to mill towns, and sold the finished product directly to farmers through agricultural suppliers and trade publications. The agricultural press covered bone meal as a legitimate product. Justus von Liebig himself, the most respected agricultural chemist of the era, wrote about the bone trade in terms that made the source of the bones entirely secondary to their chemical utility. He was not unusual in this. The question of whose bones they were was considered largely irrelevant to the question of what they were chemically worth. But here is the detail that changes how you see everything that came before it. The men whose bones were being collected were not anonymous strangers from a distant past. They were identified soldiers. They had names on regimental lists. Their families were still alive, still waiting for information about what had happened to them. And the collection happened anyway. Now here is what the actual work of bone collection involved, and what the collectors themselves understood about the material they were handling. The bone collectors who worked post-battlefield sites were not operating under the cover of night or hiding what they were doing. They arrived openly, negotiated access with local landowners, or simply moved across ground that had no active owner after the armies had departed, and worked in teams with carts, shovels, and large canvas sacks. The work was physically demanding and carried its own specific health risks. Bones from recent battlefields were often not fully decomposed, requiring collectors to handle material that was still in the process of breakdown. which produced gases and pathogens that experienced collectors learned to manage through practical habit rather than any formal understanding of infection. They worked quickly and systematically, clearing sections of ground before moving to the next. What they collected went far beyond the obvious. Teeth, which were particularly dense and slow to decompose, were separated from the bone meal supply and sold separately. Waterloo teeth, as they became known, were among the most sought-after materials for denture makers across Europe and Britain in the decades following the battle. A full set of human teeth in good condition could be fashioned into dentures that looked and functioned considerably better than the wooden or ivory alternatives of the era. Dentists and denture makers advertised Waterloo teeth specifically, the battlefield provenance being considered a guarantee of authenticity rather than a source of concern. The wealthy of Europe wore the teeth of the soldiers who had died at Waterloo in their mouths for decades after the battle. They knew where the teeth had come from. They considered the arrangement practical. The bones themselves went to the mills. A ton of processed bone meal sold for a price that made the trade commercially viable, even accounting for the transportation costs of shipping material from Belgian battlefields to English mill towns. The margins were real. The demand was consistent. And the supply, given the scale of the Napoleonic Wars and the number of other conflicts and mass graves available across Europe, appeared to the bone merchants to be essentially inexhaustible. But the most disturbing part of this story is not the battlefield collection. It's what happened when the battlefield supply started running low. Because what the bone merchants did next tells you exactly where the line was in early 19th century Europe between a resource and a person. And it turns out the line was wherever the merchants needed it to be. Here is what happened when the obvious battlefield sites had been cleared and the bone merchants needed to find new sources. They turned to pauper graves. The urban poor of 19th century Europe were buried in mass graves in public cemeteries, often with minimal marking, in plots that were routinely cleared and reused after a fixed period. The bones from these clearances were supposed to be respectfully reinterred in charnel houses or deeper in the cemetery. Instead, a documented portion of them entered the commercial bone trade. Collectors with relationships at urban cemeteries arranged access to the material from cleared plots, which then moved through the same commercial channels as battlefield bones. The paupers whose graves were cleared had no family members with the resources to monitor or object to what happened to their remains. They had no legal protection that covered this specific situation. They had no social standing that would make their treatment a matter of public concern. The bone merchants had established a precedent on battlefields, where the argument was resource efficiency. The bones are here, they are chemically valuable, it would be wasteful not to use them, and they simply applied the same logic to a different population. The pattern extended further. In some documented cases, bones from overcrowded churchyards, from catacombs being cleared for urban development, and from plague pits that construction had uncovered, also entered the commercial supply chain. Each extension of the trade followed the same logic. The bones exist. The phosphorus is real. The demand is present. The people to whom the bones originally belonged are no longer in a position to object. The agricultural chemist Justus von Liebig, who had done more than anyone to establish the scientific basis for the bone trade, eventually turned against it. Not immediately, not quickly, but in his later writing, he argued that Europe was mining its own dead to feed its living, depleting a resource that had taken centuries of conflict to accumulate, and that this was neither sustainable nor, when examined carefully, something a civilization should be comfortable describing as efficient. He was right on both counts. By the latter half of the 19th century, the development of superphosphate fertilizer from mineral deposits, and eventually the Haber-Bosch process for synthetic nitrogen fixation, made human bone meal progressively less central to agricultural chemistry. The trade declined not because it was stopped, but because it was replaced. Better chemistry arrived. The bones were no longer needed. The question of whether the trade should have been conducted the way it was conducted was never formally resolved. It simply became irrelevant when the supply was no longer required. If this story is making you think about something you had never considered before, the like button is how you tell me. It also tells the algorithm, this kind of history is worth surfacing, which means more people get to feel exactly what you are feeling right now. And if you want to keep finding history that makes the present look different than you thought it did, this channel is built entirely for that. The subscribe button means you won't miss the next one. We don't collect human bones for fertilizer anymore. The development of synthetic phosphate fertilizers from mineral deposits, and eventually the industrial-scale chemistry that makes modern agricultural inputs possible, remove the practical need for bone meal from human remains as an agricultural product. Modern bone meal fertilizer exists and is still used in organic gardening, but it comes from animal processing facilities, not from cemeteries or battlefields. The specific supply chain this story describes ended because better chemistry made it unnecessary. But the logic underneath it has not ended. The logic that says a resource is a resource and that the origin of that resource is secondary to its utility has not gone anywhere. We see it every time an extractive industry treats the land, the water, or the communities around it as inputs to be used until they are depleted, then moves on to the next available source. We see it in supply chains where the material cost of production is kept artificially low by externalizing the human cost onto populations that have no mechanism to price their own well-being into the transaction. The bone merchants were not unusual people. They were rational actors in a market that had not developed the ethical frameworks, the legal protections, or the chemical alternatives that would eventually make their specific trade unnecessary and unacceptable. Before you feel that distance, consider that every ethical framework that exists today to prevent the most obvious versions of this logic was developed in response to a specific, documented abuse that continued until it became politically or economically impossible to continue. The bone trade ended because superphosphate arrived, not because anyone decided the soldiers of Waterloo deserved better. The question of what we are currently treating as a resource that future generations will look back on as a person or a place or a thing that deserves something other than extraction is not a historical question. It is today's question, and it will be answered the same way this one was. By whatever arrives next to make the current arrangement unnecessary, or by whatever movement finally makes it unacceptable. One of those usually comes first. It has not always been the one you would hope for. Here is what I actually want you to answer. If you had been a farmer in 1820 who knew where the bone meal came from, do you think you would have used it anyway? Be honest. Tell me in the comments. This is just one harvest history grew from what it preferred not to name. You already know where to find the rest.